So I think we should start. Welcome everyone to this online seminar. Today we are quite lucky to have Dr. Rhoda Malgas with us. But before I let her take us away on her case study and research with respect to droughts, I am going to just start with a quick presentation. So I'm just going to share. I will quickly try and put my video on, but I am aware that if everyone can just mute their microphones while I'm presenting, so there's no background noise, that would be great. I'm going to start my video so that you can see me, but I turn it off if the connection lags. Okay. So today we are discussing drought. We've had previous seminars last year where we discussed the JP, the COP27. We discussed floods in South Africa as well, and relevant flood legislature. But because today is the first online seminar of the year, I thought that we could quickly recap what the Rural Action for Climate Resilience project is. It's a partnership project between the Social Change Assistance Trust, Southern African Faith Communities Environment Institute, and Heinrich Böll Stiftung, and it's funded through the European Union Climate Champions. And the aim is really to strengthen all of your capacities within your respective communities, because you are most you are best placed to come up with context appropriate approaches to responding to climate change in your different areas. So through the seminars, we hope that we can bring up more conversations around things that might be relevant to you with respect to the impact of climate change and the oncoming climate emergency that we are going to have to face and are already experiencing. So at this point, I think it's worth just acknowledging that many of us in this project are located also in areas that are currently really badly affected by floods. So I just want to acknowledge that. I know that today we're talking about droughts, but we've been hearing about people's impacts in the WhatsApp group. And our thoughts are really with you, and please let us know if there's anything that we can help in terms of understanding appropriate response measures, and also share what response measures you are taking in your different communities. So moving on from that, this year we're expected probably to have a lot more heat waves. There is this effect called the El Nino effect and the La Nina effect. Potentially Dr. Malgas will be able to shed a bit of light on, but the predictions are that we are going to be having a lot more significant heat waves from this year forward. And in that context, the conversation of drought is incredibly relevant. And at this point, I think it would be worth just having a moment to appreciate water and how that connects us all. this was a little poem on water that I think would be nice, that I thought would be nice to share today, and just center us on our connection to water and the importance of it. So the poem says, "The water in your body is just visiting. It was a thunderstorm a week ago. It will be the ocean soon enough. Most of your cells come and go like morning dew. We are more weather pattern than stone monument. Sunlight on mist. Summer lightning. Your choices outweigh your substance." So at this point, I'm going to ask Claire quickly to launch. We have a poll. It's the first time that we're doing this, so I'm hoping that it works. But you should be able to, while I'm presenting the rest of this presentation, there should be a poll that you see in the bottom tab. And you should be able to respond to 2 questions. And the one is, have you experienced a drought in the last 2 years? And then the second is a list of potential methods that you might have used to cope. So I will give you a few minutes to respond to that, and I'll actually let it run throughout the session so that people can answer and have enough time to think about it. And then we can have a look at that at the end when we get into our discussion. So just before we get into our final, the final few slides, I just wanted to quickly cover something about water governance in South Africa. And I thought this might be relevant in this seminar. So we have in South Africa 9 water management areas and catchment management agencies. And these are the different areas that are listed in the different colors. And essentially they are areas that all have the same water source. So one or multiple, a network of catchment areas that feed this the geographic area that is shown in the map according to the different colors. And essentially the water management areas and catchment management agencies are responsible for developing a catchment management strategy in order to manage water resources in the area, and also to coordinate between all the different institutions that are within the catchment, the water management area. And they're also responsible for sustainable water use, promoting cooperative governance, and promoting community participation in water resource management. And it should be noted that they're not responsible for the provision of water services. So their role is purely related to water resource management, and local government must align with the catchment management strategy put forward by the catchment management agencies within their integrated development plan. These are the service providers who are responsible for actually providing the service of water and sanitation. So we have 15 water boards, and they are responsible for operating dams and bulk water supply, retail infrastructure, and some of the wastewater systems. And they report to the National Department of Water Affairs. And then we have the water service authorities, and these are essentially municipalities, local governments, that are responsible for access to water services. And then you have water service providers, which in some cases will also be the same as your water service authority. Sometimes they are external service providers, but they are responsible for the provision of the actual service of water. So now, for today, we are very lucky to have Dr. Rhoda Malgas with us, who will be discussing a more hands-on and sort of practical example of how people have responded to drought, and it's building on work that she has done with EMG, the Environmental Monitoring Group, and she's currently based at Stellenbosch University, and we are very grateful for her time. So I'm going to quickly stop sharing my screen. You, Rhoda, thank you so much for being here.
Thanks, Dara. Good morning, and good morning, everyone. I'm signing in from. Thank you for having me today. So I must just quickly say that the work that I'm going to talk about today is based on my experience having lived in the Northern Cape some time ago, and also then continuing conversations and relationships with farmers up north. That was my window into drought in earlier years in my career, but also continues to be now as farmers are trying to sustain production of livestock and rooibos tea in that context up north. So a little bit of what I'll be talking about is from an academic point of view, but also just from a personal experience with drought myself, having retained those relationships over a long period of time. So thank you very much for having me. I will also cut my video. All right, so I thought I would just talk about what drought is, because drought is defined in different ways in the literature. And then I would imagine that filters through into how it's talked about in policy instruments. So just what is drought? Then where is drought? From what I understand, most of you are operating in the Western Cape, Northern Cape, and Eastern Cape provinces, which also happens to coincide from my ecological point of view across the fynbos biome. So that is usually my lens into which I look at drought, but to all intents and purposes, I thought a geographic view would be a good idea. And then just a quick scope of useful policies that might be useful, going quite broad internationally all the way down to local government. And then lastly, some lessons learned, and then I'll just share some narratives from my own experience of drought in the Northern Cape. So what is drought? So I think we all know and understand that it's a precipitation deficiency, right? There's not enough water in the landscape, but it also has to do with it's not just the amount, it's also the intensity. So right now, for instance, I think this morning on my way to work, I heard on SAFM that there's flooding in parts of the country, in Mpumalanga, I think it was. So the intensity, the rain is coming, but it's coming too much, too fast. And then the timing of the rain. In the Northern Cape, our experience was that the rain was coming later in the rainy season. Still, that part of the world still falls in the summer, in the winter rainfall region, but the rains were only arriving, let's say, in May and not in March or April. So that had repercussions for production. So it's the amount, intensity, and timing of precipitation deficiency that is the issue there. And when that happens, then we have reduced infiltration. In other words, when the surface on the landscape has become crusted, then water can't infiltrate into the deeper layers. So all the animals and other species, the plants and animals in the crust and in the earth's surface don't have enough water. You've got lots of runoff because there's no percolation, so water doesn't get in. And what that means in the longer term is that groundwater recharge, so the underground water storage is negated. So that's problematic. The other thing that defines drought for us is if there's high temperature, when it's extremely windy, like we have here in the Western Cape with southeaster in summer, when humidity is low, in other words, it's very hot and there's no moisture in the air, you've got intense sunshine and less cloud cover, blue sky with not a sign of a cloud in the sky. Those, I think we all know, those of us who live in these landscapes know what that kind of drought looks like, right? And what that means is that water then evaporates faster off land surfaces. So dams, lakes, ponds, wetlands, we have faster evaporation and transpiration from plants. And that is what then eventually leads to what we call an agricultural drought. So all of what I've just explained to you now is called meteorological drought, right? And now we get into agricultural drought then. That's probably where those of us who operate landscapes can understand, or just closer to our experience, I guess. So here we're talking soil water deficiency. In other words, there's just not enough moisture in the soil. And of course, plants and animals, and let me add other species like fungi and bacteria, they suffer water stress. And essentially what happens is, whether you're a maize farmer, a rooibos farmer, a cattle farmer, a sheep farmer, you're losing biomass, your plants wilt, your plants struggle to grow, seeds die before they even get a chance to germinate, germination rates are low, and all of these lead to yield losses for farmers. I think that's a touch point that we all are familiar with, and that's probably our biggest concern in terms of food security. And then these agricultural droughts, so that's kind of in the short term, those are the things we experience seasonally, but they lead to longer term effects as well, which is called hydrological drought. And hydrological drought is when the reduced steam flow into our natural systems, like pans, lakes, wetlands, are reduced, and essentially means that the habitats of the species that we are reliant on for pollination, for pest control, and so on, are severely negated and fragmented. And so that is what leads to hydrological drought. Okay, so just different ways the drought is talked about. And this is just a framework. I just want to mention here that these forms of drought, which you can see on the right-hand side of this schema, intensifies with time, right? So meteorological drought is something we experienced on a shorter term. Agricultural drought is something maybe on a seasonal or monthly, maybe even yearly cycles. But the hydrological are the ones that go on for a very long period of time, because it takes a very long time for those underground water storage capacity to build up, right? So when we are pumping water out from the landscape with boreholes and so on, we are accessing water that took a very long time to recharge. And obviously, when droughts become more severe, not only do we have less recharge, but we're also taking more of that water out. So the rate at which these things happen are disproportionate to the need for water. And essentially, the outcome is, of course, economic impact, social impacts, and environmental impacts, all of which I'm sure we're familiar with. So just a little bit of a scope to see what things were looking like last year, and just to show how variable it is across South Africa as well. I've pulled some data on dam fullness, for the different provinces. Now, this is from the 6th of February 2022, and we are now in the 6th of February 2023, so that was last week. And just to say, if you compare the dates between, if you compare the dam storage for those two dates, then this is the variance, right? So the Eastern Cape has more water in this week than it did last year. The Free State is down, Limpopo is down, and the Northern Cape is down. The Western Cape is down by the highest amount at 19.4. So just to say that these things are quite variable. And of course, this is just one date in the month, right? You'd have to have some kind of time series analysis to see exactly how these fluctuations take place over a period of time. But this was just a kind of a flash visual to show that things are variable across the country and that they vary across time as well. But where are the dry zones in South Africa? Here in Stellenbosch, it's a nice sunny day. I'm certainly not experiencing any drought or, it's dry around here, but I'm not experiencing floods like I know colleagues in this platform are doing, or know of people who are. So where are the spots that we are concerned for in South Africa? So this is what is called a Köppen climate classification system, and just kind of a very basic visual of where our dry places are. Our colleagues and friends in the Northern Cape, in the Meer district, kind of further north, that would be where extensive cattle farming usually is is practiced. We've got the lower parts here in the pink area, cold desert climate. So that's where the Bokkerveld parts of the Karoo are. Our friends up in the northwestern part of the Cape Floristic region would experience these weather conditions. Those of us here in the Western Cape have warm Mediterranean climate. So we have a winter rainfall region, which is different from the rest of the country, that goes all the way southeast. And then our friends and colleagues in the Southern Cape towards the Eastern Cape border have temperate Mediterranean climate with a little bit of warm oceanic climate coming up sometimes, and some humid tropical climate in other places. So it's this western part of the country that we are especially concerned for. You will see that the other parts of the country where it's greener, that's where aridity is less of an issue. However, even those areas have experienced climate change related changes over the last decades. And so although it shows up as a less critical area, those areas are also affected. So they're not exempt from climate change impacts. This is a rainfall map. So just to say again that the drier parts get less rainfall. The blue, the deeper the color, the more rainfall is recorded in those areas. And so the parts of the country that we are concerned for are especially the western parts, and those are the provinces, the Northern Cape, Western Cape, Eastern Cape provinces most affected. So for those of you in the Eastern Cape, I just drew some data here from a paper that was published in 2021, I think. So this is recent data, and just 2 water basins in the Eastern Cape. And just notice here that so you've got the 2, Impofu and Koga, have similar fluctuations over time. In some cases, quite deep troughs. So, when there's lots of water and then very little, over a sharp, there's a sharp decrease over a few years. But notice that actually just at 100% stored, that's what we want. But sometimes it goes down to only 20%. And so that's concerning. Also notice that although Darlington is very close to Koga, just the way that the topography works is that Darlington actually has far less storage. And so storage capacity, they're quite limited, up to a maximum of 60% from 1980 to 2020. And in the last few years, hasn't risen above 40%. So that would be quite a challenge for the people in that region. And there's just a quote from a newspaper article that was published in 2021 in June, just citing some of the problems. So ailing infrastructure, just little governmental capacity to deal with water provision. And then further in this article, the government spokesperson, Mr. Malgas, carries on to say that 3,000 leaks have been identified in this particular region, and that government is scrambling to get those leaks fixed. But a lot of water is wasted. And more than that, he said, it's also that there's been an increase in water consumption and use across the Eastern Cape. So you've got ailing infrastructure, lowered water, less water coming into the system from just rainfall and precipitation, and on top of that, you've got increased consumption. In the Western Cape, we all know that we at some point faced a day zero in 2018, but by that time, 500 million liters of water a day was being used. Right, it has increased by 50% in January 2021. By 8 to 800 million liters per day. The article in this case, the author was trying to make the point that we seem to have forgotten in the Western Cape about day zero, and we've kind of carried on, but warns in the article that we should not be so quick to forget what that meant, and we should be considering going back to the practices of water saving. Because we cannot live as though day zero is never going to happen again, or that threat will never be there again. So in the Western Cape, although we've got dams that have higher precipitation areas. So the bigger the circle, the more water storage there is. In this case, you can see that the central Karoo is worst off. In the Eden district, a little bit better. And then in the Western Cape, Cape Winelands, which is where we operate, we have more water storage capacity there. So, that's a warning for us in the Western Cape. Do not think that it's better days now that our water capacity has been restored somewhat over the last years, because it doesn't stay like that. And then lastly, in the Northern Cape, I think that probably all of us can appreciate that the Northern Cape is the most arid part of our country. I found it interesting in this paper that I found by Matlow 2019 that only 189 farming households that were surveyed in this study were not resilient to agricultural drought. And only 18 were seen to be resilient. So if you've got 189 farming households, and let's assume that there are between 4 and 8 people per household, that is a lot of people. I'm sure you also know of news of recent death in the Northern Cape, where farm workers didn't have access to water, so loss of life. But I thought maybe something else that's also quite telling, and which I see in the literature, is even how drought is affecting people socially and even psychologically, taking its toll on mental health, especially amongst youth, in this case in the Daily Maverick article. So just to say that the effects of drought are far-reaching, far beyond even just the biophysical aspects that people like I study. So, that people like me study. So then just a rainfall gauge here for Calvinia, which is close, that's in the Hantam district municipality. You'll see that a median rainfall, so in other words, 50% of the data falls under 20 odd percent, and 50% falls over. So that's a very low median for rainfall. It's 20 mils per annum. And up to 50 mils, and that's really not, it's not wonderful. 50 mils per annum is just not a wonderful state of affairs for any province. And this is the data set that carries on from 1971 through to 1998. And you can see that we had higher peaks between 1971 to about 1982. And after that, except for that spike in 1986 and another spike in 1996, it hardly makes it past the median of 20 mils per annum. So that's the state for the Northern Cape. So on to some policy instruments. I'm sure that I see from the chat that a lot of you are with paralegal centers and advice officers, so this is not news to you, that we are signatories as South Africans to the UNCCD and the UNFCCC. The UNCCD is the only international binding agreement for us to be part of. It was established in 1994. I think that South Africa joined in 1997. And we have a responsibility to submit these country reports. I looked up the country reports for South Africa. The last one that was submitted was in 2018. And I think that we can all use our sensibilities and say that surely by 2023, just a few years later, we have far exceeded what the norm was in 2018. So whatever that report said about what South Africa is doing and can do around climate change, I would say that probably the needs by now are far more desperate. It is being compounded by all kinds of other challenges we face, ESCOM not being the least of them. And let's not forget the effects of COVID-19 as well. So those country reports are outdated at the moment. I contacted a colleague who's an environmental lawyer the other day, just to ask if she had any news about updated versions. And she herself was questioning whether we are keeping up with our international treaties. Not to say that we are not participating. I do think government is doing what it's supposed to do, but those country reports and actively bringing closer the conventions into our national policy seems to be a limitation from what I can tell just from the resources I've been looking at. The United Nations Framework for Convention on Climate Change is something that South Africa is also a signatory to. Again, not much information there, but I suppose to my colleagues in the policy space, I would say that these are two two conventions that we can use to hold government accountable and responsible for when it comes to our national policies and local government policies. We can say, but we are signatory to the UNCCD, and according to the latest, let's say, COP15, which happened in May 2022, these are the commitments we made. This is what we should be doing. And so that could be one way to motivate government to do what it's meant to do. There are national policies like the climate change bill, which is quite topical now. I see that our colleagues at the Center for Environmental Rights had an information session about it yesterday, which I unfortunately couldn't attend. But that's the kind of space that I would also advise people to get involved with, when the climate change bill is being workshopped and talked about. For a quick overview of what the climate change bill entails, I just put down a link here. So it's just a small article, nothing academic, and just what that means for those of us on the ground in terms of climate change and how we can respond. Of course, on the higher levels, the Constitution, Section 24 especially, that is what I teach about here at the university in terms of environmental responsibility on part of government. And of course, any national or international policies that South Africa commits itself to has to be within the limits of the Constitution. I always remind my students that, of course, when we're dealing with one aspect of environment, like in this case, drought, of course, the Water Act, the National Environmental Management Biodiversity Act, even the Conservation of Agricultural Lands, Agricultural Resources Act, CARA, all of those acts come into effect now. The climate change bill is the closest that we have to a drought-specific piece of legislation. But just to say that there are, of course, other pieces of legislation that also interact with it. And then we have our provincial government departments. Those are all who will take responsibility. To my mind, the three that are probably most pertinent are environment, forestry and fisheries at national, agricultural, land reform and rural development, and water and sanitation. And then for the different provinces, they of course have different names, so speak to different portfolios. And I'm sure all of you know how to get this kind of information, but websites and things like that I find are outdated. Information isn't really readily available. So one has to dig around a little bit further to find relevant information. I would argue that these are the spaces that government should be keeping up to date, but I guess there are other things keeping people busy at the moment. But these are the public spaces where those international conventions should be filtering down through, right? These are the instruments that should be doing that. There are people who are doing the work anyway, and just because we can't see the things in the public space with government, I also would like to believe that there are government officials working hard and colleagues working to realize the goals of these international conventions. But a bit closer to home and in my own sphere of work, there's Drought, which is an international NGO association. It is open to different NGOs across the world. I know that my colleagues are working with people in the rest of Africa, in France, in South America. And so Drought is a wonderful resource. You're welcome to check it out, see what people across the world are doing and how people are responding. And in South Africa, the Environmental Monitoring Group and Indigo Development and Change are two Drought NGOs, two members of Drought. And I'm a board member with Indigo. So that's like two organizations in South Africa that belong to that international society. SA Adaptation Network is a wonderful space for people of really from NGO, grassroots organizations, academia, government departments, just a whole wide range of people actively engaged in adaptation work across gender, food security, climate change, ecological infrastructure, nature-based solutions, all of those things. So a very vibrant network, and I'm a member of Adaptation Network from Stellenbosch University side. And what I like about this network is that you can join as an individual or as an organization. And we get into our inboxes every week news and information that's relevant to all things adaptation, funding opportunities, job opportunities, internship opportunities, information sessions. So I would like to strongly advise those of you with an active interest in adaptation issues that's a good network to join. Indigo Development and Change is an NGO based in the Northern Cape. It's also an NGO that I am part of the leadership of. You are welcome to have a look there what Indigo does for inspiration there, in that case, with small-scale farmers. The Centre for Environmental Rights, I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with, based in Cape Town. And they advocate, so they take government to court or any other parties, actually not even just government, and have been winning cases that have been really inspiring. So the Centre for Environmental Rights is a great place to look for and keep up to date with policy and action. The Arizona Ecology Forum, together with the Water Research Commission and the South African Environmental Observation Network, are 3 research portals. They generate data, maps, information on drought in the biophysical sphere, so ecology, environment, water, and so on. These are 3 research-based institutions, and so I would say that this is more appropriate for researchers and those of you who are trying to influence policy with data and data-driven evidence. So those 3, and also these 3 organizations have a responsibility and a mandate to also make this science palatable for the public. So you can engage with any one of them and try to get the information in a way that is less scientific and more easy, or rather, how can I say this? So it's scientific, but just easier to understand for those of us who are not so afraid with the jargon of science. The Council for Scientific and Industrial Research obviously also informs policy decisions in South Africa. I think you probably are quite familiar with him. South African Weather Service, interestingly, had a whole portal on education around weather. I see that is no longer in place anymore, but they do generate forecasts that are very helpful for people on the ground because it's written in a very simple way and with maps that are easy to understand. So the Weather Service has actually become quite a nice service to use. South North is now involved in a project that's funded through the UK organization. It's called Adaptation Research Alliance. And that's trying to bridge the gap between researchers and people on the ground, trying to address issues of drought and other climate issues collectively, but together through research. And then maybe one thing that I didn't know about, but that I heard about last year, was the Presidential Climate Commission that makes funding and also information opportunities available. This is a high-level commission, and I know a colleague who serves in this climate commission. One of their latest activities is to try to incorporate local and indigenous knowledge into climate response. So that work carries on in the background. I'm sorry, but this may be something useful to know about. I'd like to use the last few minutes just to talk about climate change from my personal experience. So when I was still a student at UCT many years ago, we started this process with small-scale farmers where we would share the latest source forecast and then work through that ourselves and then present it to the farmers in a way that was easy for them to understand, and then workshop how that would be for them. So basic questions would be: how did we experience the weather? What did we do in response? And what do we wish we could have done but couldn't? And that gave us as researchers an opportunity to also hear how people were trying to be creative and innovative in their own spaces. And if there were things that were lacking, like resources, money, fencing, whatever, it gave the NGO partners an opportunity to know what to look for funding for. So very targeted and strategic fundraising around very specific activities that were entirely driven by people in that community. So the climate change workshops, I think, are fairly easy to replicate as a process, but it is a process and it does require a long-term relationship so that people really do get the benefit of these forecasts and their own strategic planning around expected weather. This is one of the farmers that I know, Klonkies, in the Northern Cape. Here they had dug trenches for heavy rains that were forecast, and you can see how we managed to avert rain from getting onto his rooibos tea field, which is just behind him, and also making sure that that water stays in what is otherwise quite a dry landscape. That's a fynbos koppie right in front of his house, and he's explaining how the water took its path and how he was able to avert major flood damage to his rooibos tea lands. I'm also finding that there's a colleague at UWC, his name is Clement Cupido. He is an old friend and colleague whom I met many years ago in the Northern Cape province. But he works with small-scale livestock communal land users in the Namakwa district. And Clement has decided to, so he's an amateur photographer and loves film and photos. So he has started a YouTube channel where he shares stories of climate struggle amongst the farmers that he works with. And I thought just to hear those people speak about their experiences is really, it gives you a real life context, and it also is inspiration for, how one can respond. And so that brings my talk to an end. I think for all that climate change is a difficult thing, I certainly as a researcher always feel optimistic when I see how people pull together and work together for collective action. And it is my impression from the SAFCEI work that I've seen so far that, this is the ethos, this idea of collective action. And it's something, I think that's something to be proud of. It's an ethos to be proud of, and it's something that I try to espouse with my own students. So thank you for that good example. And I'm hoping that the academic community can be of service to those of you who are at the front line of these climate change issues that we do the research about. We wish you all the very best in your endeavors, I guess is what I'd like to end off saying. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Malgas. That was a really, really great presentation. Very illuminating on multiple fronts. I want to ask if anyone would like to come forward with some questions. I see that many of you have answered the poll, and most of us have experienced drought in the last 2 years, or at least within the last 10 years. So I'm sure that many of you have personal experiences with drought and may have, in particular, some questions that you might want to ask. This is a great opportunity. So I'll just maybe leave you all for, give you a few minutes to think about some questions that you might have. Eddie, I see you have your hand raised. Do you want to go ahead?
Hello, thank you very much, Chair, and thanks to Dr. Malgas. I just wanted to find out, for some of us who are staying in rural areas, is there any way we can engage with our local municipalities to get information with regards to their plans for this climate change and global warming?
Eddie, thank you. I think so the answer is that I actually don't know. I think from my impression, just as a citizen in South Africa, is that municipalities are struggling even with their basic mandates. And I would imagine that something like climate change is not being directly addressed at the moment as a priority as it should be. And I don't think it's because people don't think that it should be. I think that our local municipalities are just entirely strapped for cash, time, resources, human capacity, and all kinds of things. I must say I found that the NGO sector has been far more responsive and far more active on the ground. And in terms of getting information to people through WhatsApp, for instance, through just, TikTok videos even. I know of people generating TikTok videos to get messages about climate out to youth. But in terms of what your local municipality is doing, I would imagine that your ward councillor would be the person to ask that question to and hold them accountable for it. And your municipal meetings, I'm sure that there are opportunities on the agenda to raise issues like that, but usually the councillors are the one. So Eddie, if you can find your councillor and, make some fire under the councillor, that will probably be your most direct gateway to your local municipality in terms of action, climate change action.
Thanks, Doc.
You're welcome, Eddie. I feel so like that is not a very helpful answer, because, if you knock on the door of that person and that person doesn't open or doesn't get to your request, it's also not very helpful. So one of the things that I've seen over the years is how collective action in a group, amongst a group of people, can really be a force for change. And so maybe not in your individual capacity, but if there's a group of people, the concerned citizens of so-and-so, Lebode, who's going to approach the municipality, I do want to motivate those of you who feel despondent with if you do feel despondent with your local councillor, maybe you don't, and your local municipal people, then, there's strength in numbers, and doing something collectively is often has better results if there's no attention to the individual request.
Thank you for that.
Hi, Doc. I have a question for you.
Go for it. Go for it.
Hi, Doc. My name is Eugene. I'm from Beaufort West. From your presentation, I also saw where you spoke about the policies, where you also spoke about the Water Act. The problem is we are having a problem of water in this town, and really the community is not catching water, and there's also misuse of the water that is there. So any plan of forcing the municipality to make sure that the act is being implemented so that the water can be saved. And it is a town where we suffered from drought, to experience of drought. Thanks.
Eugene, I think it's probably the same chronic issue of bringing policy into the lives of people. And I wonder whether there aren't others. I see that there's a whole lot of people from paralegal advice centers and advisory people in advisory policy positions who can maybe answer this question better than I can. But I also want to, so I feel like I can't say anything other than what I've already said to Eddie about, knocking on the door of your councillor, because the councillors are your first port of call. But I also wonder whether, there's that response, and then there's also the personal response. In other words, what people in a community can mobilize to do together. So rainwater harvesting, for instance, is something that people in other African countries are working hard to do, especially in places where they have floods. So I've been reviewing a series of projects for another organization over the last 2 weeks, and learned a lot about what people are doing in Ghana, in Kenya, Tanzania, where people live on riverbanks, the riverbanks flood, and now people are creatively thinking together about how they can capture that water. And so, if there are rainwater systems that could be implemented, so in other words, not just telling the councillor, this is what's wrong and we want you to make the policy more relevant to us, but actually saying, and this is how we want it. We want one Jojo tank per every 3 households for the next, within the next year or something like that. So something practical that at the household level can help people cope. Because essentially when you run out of water, it is, you can live without a car, you can live without fuel, you can live without DSTV, you can live without a lot of things, but you cannot live without water. And so if there's anything people can do at the household levels to help themselves, then it should be that, as well as, keeping policy advocates and people mandated to realize policy accountable.
Are there any other questions from the audience? Also, feel free to come to chime in, or also write questions in the chat box if you would like.
Cara, can I come in with a question? Sorry, I didn't raise my hand on my phone.
Yeah, sure. Go for it.
Hi, so thank you so much for the presentation, and I can hear you have a wealth of knowledge that I wish we had you for a few more hours. Sorry, my name is Karen. I'm the Heinrich Böll Foundation. I'm just wondering whether you could talk a little bit more about the kinds of actions that came out from the workshop series that you did. I think you said when you were at UCT, when you asked people, you know, what was your experience? What do you wish you had? And what do you wish you had? And particularly, I'd be interested to hear of responses that speak to the issue you just mentioned around collective action, because I mean, I absolutely agree that, I mean, regardless of political will, our municipalities are in crisis, and often, even if they want to help, they can't. And I really feel like we don't have any other way but to sometimes just start things on our own, and hope that, you know, we can build a collaboration with the municipality. And I'm also sort of remembering in Cape Town, in response to Day Zero, in neighborhoods, they set up water crisis committees, which were a little bit community action networks that came up in COVID. So yeah, I'd be really interested to hear more about that. Thanks.
Yeah, thanks, Karen. Thank you very much. So I do remember from that time, and let me also just remind you that we started that in 2004. These climate change workshops, preparedness workshops, still take place in 2023. I think that is something to note, because institutional processes like that usually fall apart within the first year or two, or funding dries up after year 2 to 5, and then the process ends, and that's that. What has been a help here in this context, and that may be helpful for those of you across the provinces, is that there were these two NGOs, that was EMG and Indigo Development and Change, that had located themselves in that landscape, and they were able to hold the process going even when the funding drew up. So they could carry on with the process no matter project timelines, no matter changes in government officials, no matter whether the Department of Agriculture was or wasn't helping. All of that, they kept a stable presence and a stable process in place, which was very helpful. Secondly, the farmers were members of the Ryneveld Cooperative, and because they were organized in that particular context, it was, you know, a dedicated group of people with whom these two NGOs could work, with dedicated business and a constitution in place and so on, all of which created stability and a platform to work together. So that is, I think, what strengthened the institutional collaboration, is that these were entities that were formal and functional and could sustain it for such a long period of time. So what the farmers actually did, I remember one occasion where we had been talking about, so we had secured some small funds from, I think it was the Jeff Small Grants program at the time. And farmers were being asked how they're experiencing the drought in the context of climate change with rooibos tea production. And what we found was that farmers in the north were plowing their land in a particular way. So they were plowing with the contours, you know, if there's a hill, then they were plowing parallel to the hill. What we found in another section of the production area is that farmers were plowing downhill, simply because it was easier in terms of the tractor and what they could manage between rocky outcrops and so on. The second group of farmers, having talked to the first group of farmers, found out that actually what they're doing is creating furrows for water to come down in a flood event. And so they're opening up the landscape. Of course, if you remove vegetation, the land becomes more unstable. And just changing their plowing direction was one thing that those farmers did that then helped them to withstand the effects of the flood. So that was one example. Another example was a visit that farmers in the Northern Cape took to Nair district. So that's up further north in the desert landscape. And there they saw that farmers had packed they were constructing wind belts, but you know, wind belts are usually parallel in our landscapes. You find them in wine, in vineyards and in orchards and so on, orchards. But what they had done was they packed them in a star and not in a row, because what they found was that if the wind changes and the wind is now blowing with the row that you've planted, then there you lose your topsoil. So what they did was, instead of have a parallel wind belts, they made star-shaped wind belts. And then it didn't matter what direction the wind was blowing from, your crop was protected. So those are very basic examples of what farmers did, just, applying their own creative minds to their situations. Rainwater harvesting was another thing, by the way, getting JoJo tanks from the local Agrimark and putting it up outside the kookskerm or the house, and then monitoring that water and also testing water quality for use at home. And I thought another very cool thing was that the NGOs got a weather station for the Said Bokafel. So people could actually go to the weather station on a weekly basis, did some citizen science and recording the information, and then sent it to the officers. And then the officers could incorporate that data into the weather forecast, because the weather forecast is regional. So they had some local data on which to base their forecasts. And in that way, the farmers also engaged with the equipment, but also learned how to read temperature and rainfall and interpret that for their own lands, for their own farming experience. So another thing that they did was they got solar panels, very small ones that would light one light bulb or maybe two. And the way that people live in the Said Bokafel, they live in Rikieshuise. So these are mat, like the Khoi used to live. It's still a way of living for them. And so, to light one structure like that with a solar panel has changed how people can operate now, because now they've got light at night to be able to do things. So small changes, but that have had significant impact. And for me, quite importantly, community driven. The people taking responsibility and agency for their own well-being and doing the best they can with what they have.
I saw there was a hand from Nozuko, but I see that maybe her connection dropped. But okay, it's written in the chat box. I'll just quickly read it out. So it says, how possible is it for us as LDAs, which is local development agencies, to provide workshops for municipal councillors on climate change so that we can assist those, so that they can assist us in those areas we cannot reach, and it can be easy for us to cover a big area?
Yeah, I think that's a wonderful idea. I mean, if there's the energy and the time to do it, please do. And I would say, even if the councillors didn't come or couldn't come, because as you also mentioned, Tara, it's municipal. I think it was Karen who said municipalities are just they're largely dysfunctional because of resource constraints. What that would do is that it would mobilize people to get together to talk about a common problem, and in the spirit of collective action, try to do something about it. B, it would inspire other people in that local community that something is happening and something positive. And, even if you don't manage to get the councillors involved, it might have other positive spin-offs locally. And then third of all, if you can reach those remote places, the councillors might actually welcome this kind of approach where you're saying, well, we'd like to include you. How can we cooperate together? And, and then if they manage to come, you have a win. And if they don't come, you still have a win. But you will have put agency to the fore. And there are ways to find funding for these kinds of things. And I would strongly urge you to maybe connect with the South African Adaptation Network to find where those resources might be for workshops like this. And also maybe just stay in touch with funding opportunities to make these kinds of things work. Farmer exchange visits are really powerful things where farmers or any other residents can learn from other communities who are similar to their own. You don't even need a transport budget. People can walk there and back if it's within distance. So I do want to encourage that if you're able to pull off these workshops and invite the councillors, please do. I think it's a wonderful idea.
Any other questions from the audience?
Thank you, Tara. Can I enter?
Yeah, go for it.
Okay. I think why I'm raising this question of councillors, it's because if you look our municipalities, we are in crisis. Some of us, in fact, I must speak for Port St. John's. when you look at Port St. John's, it's not functional. At the moment, because of poor service delivery, there are toys. We are in trouble now. And when you speak with the manager who is responsible on climate change, you will find out, no, this thing, we take it to councillors. When you ask councillors, they did not know anything about it. So that's why I'm raising this issue to include them.
Yes.
And traditional leaders as doorkeepers of these areas. And unfortunately for us in Port St. John's, there is this thing of demarcation, where there are places that we are not servicing at all as LDA now, because it's too far from us. So if we include them and their traditional leaders, maybe it can be easy for us, so that the areas that we can reach, they are fortunate for to go there, but for other areas we can do that. Thanks so much.
Nozuko, can I just say that actually one of the papers that I went through in preparation for this presentation was actually focusing on 5 municipalities in that area. I actually took the trouble to make a map and map those areas, and Port St. John's was one of the local municipalities that was included in this data set for generating drought information, and also talking about some of the policy things. I'm very happy to send that paper to you, I don't know to what extent you will find the paper helpful, but more than the paper, it's the researchers that I would like to connect you with. If there are academics who are passionate about the same topic, they have other sets of powers, maybe not the same kind of power as the councillor, let's say. They can't affect or affect policy easily, maybe. But then you have somebody in your corner who can offer data and evidence for why the crisis, what the crisis is and how the crisis could possibly be addressed. So happy to share that with you, and maybe you can contact the authors. I don't even mind being the person to connect you as a fellow academic and telling these guys, look, here are people trying to do something, can you help them? And the other note I wanted to say is that I found over the years that when it comes to collective action, it's extremely difficult, of course, because we have to work together. But when people see some other people doing something positive, it does something. It generates hope. It makes people wake up and think, but if my neighbor can do this, then maybe I can do that. And even if those people in those more remote municipalities with very poor service figure that the people in the other catchment basin, let's say, are concerned for them and want to do something to help them, it inspires and encourages, and it offers hope in a way that even if you can't get to the biophysical things immediately, I really believe in those human elements. Something happens when positive action is taken with the right heart and mind, and with good intent. So if you can get the traditional leaders, and if the traditional leaders themselves can't make it, then the people who represent them, anybody who is willing and able to join your workshops should come, and hopefully the councillors will also get there. And if they don't, your neighbors in these other parts will know that somebody cared enough to think about them. And I really think that that counts for something.
Yeah, thank you so much for that response. And I think, if you want to connect with Nomboniso, I can, feel free to share that information, and I can put you in touch. Claire has just written in the chat, within the Rural Action for Climate Resilience project, we have grants of 8,000 Rand that can be used for workshops of this nature. So just, bear in mind, if that is something that you're interested in, get in touch with Claire on that. Are there any further questions from the audience?
If I could just add maybe that these workshops do not have to be very expensive. Usually the greatest expense is transport for people coming from wherever they're coming from. You may want to set your rate. You don't want people charging you $4.50 per kilometer. Maybe all you can afford is $2.50 per kilometer or whatever. You have people carpool. But essentially you need a budget for transport, and then a meal. this is something I tell my students now. I teach in a science program, but I always tell them, do not underestimate the power of eating together. And I'm not just talking about provision of a meal to get people to come. I don't subscribe to that kind of ethos. I'm talking about breaking bread together because it's a human and dignified way to get together. I find that over the meal, that's where the information happens. That's where people say, I really tried to dig this thing, but I couldn't because my spades are all broken and stolen. And, and somebody says, yeah, but I've got a spade for you. Don't worry about it. So, the meal is quite important. So transport, meal, and then we don't use any projectors. We use paper and pen. We use what we have. It's not that expensive to run these workshops. So please don't be put off by costs if you're strapped for resources. You don't need a lot of resources to make this happen.
Yeah, thank you so much. Any last comments or questions? I have a few questions of my own, but I will wait until everyone has had a chance to go first. Okay, maybe while people are thinking a little bit more, I just had, you mentioned a question. I had a question about something you mentioned around the pumping out of water as a response to the different kind of drought situations. And I was wondering if you could explain a little bit more about that and the long-term impacts of, for example, borehole installation as a response to drought.
When I explain these things to my students, I usually tell them, if you consider a sponge, let's take a sponge, right? One of those yellow things that you scrub the pots with. So you've got a yellow sponge. Now let's assume that it's raining. So obviously now the sponge gets full of water. If you put a straw in the sponge, you can suck some of that water out. So that's the borehole. If you've got two people throwing water out of the same sponge and at the same precipitation level, then that's fine. But if you've got 100 people with straws in the same sponge, you can imagine that the sponge is going to get empty faster. And so that's essentially how it works. We've got these massive storage, geological storage facilities underground in the earth crust. They take a very long time to fill up because water seeps in through the soil, makes it past rocks and sand and all kinds of things to eventually get into the soil. There's also the fact that we harvest a lot of that water for agriculture, for washing our cars and ourselves and our children and our parents and so on. So a lot of that water already doesn't get put back into the earth because we are using it. And then of the water that does make it through, it takes a very long time. So by the time we are dropping boreholes, let's say in the 1980s, we are accessing water that has been there maybe already since the 18th and 19th century, you see, because it took that long for that water to get there. So actually, the deeper we are going into our aquifers, we are tapping ancient water, we are tapping old water that has been in storage for a long time, and we're using it. And unfortunately for us, we are using it faster than it is being replenished. And so I've never been an advocate for boreholes as an easy go-to for dealing with drought. But at the same time, I say that knowing that, of course, I live a privileged life in a municipality that's A, functional, and B, where I can open a tap and the water is there. So I realize that. But I've recently spoken to farmers in the Namakwa district. These are commercial farmers who have been reeling from drought since 2000. There was one in 2003, again in 2010. There was another bout in 2013. And, every time they're just getting to where they can cope, another drought hits. So it's been really hard for them. And I know farmers who, although they've now been granted rights to boreholes, are refusing to go into the boreholes any further for several reasons. A, it is now too expensive because as the water table is dropping, as the sponge is, the level of water in the sponge is going lower and lower because of all the straws, the straw has to go deeper and deeper to find the water. And that comes at massive cost. That's the infrastructure. It's the bore. It's the bore of that makes the hole is extremely expensive. You need equipment to bring that in to be able to do it, and Then the other cost is maintaining the borehole, because you need a pump. And with electricity outages, the pumps aren't working. You need solar energy for that, and the solar technology is too expensive. So in the end, when the farmer had to decide whether to go for the borehole water or not, they have now actually decided against it for those reasons. So that's the kind of philosophy about why boreholes is not, the long-term solution to an immediate problem, although at the same time people need to live. And so boreholes, I think, should be a concession, not the go-to first-hand response, is my kind of educated guess.
Okay, thank you so much. Yeah, that gives a lot of more background to the whole, because I think it's a big conversation around when to put in boreholes and when not to.
Yes.
And we see that a lot of municipalities struggling with water are taking boreholes or proposing boreholes as a response to supplement the water supply.
Yes. Yeah, and it should be a concession. And I also think, if municipalities also encouraged households to watch water use, fixing leaks is a very big drive, and that should continue. I don't know with what success the Eastern Cape in that article has managed to do that. 3,000 leaks reported. Those are only the ones reported. Let me add that, of course, with higher temperatures and less water in systems, the infrastructure dries out. So plastic pipes become brittle. Copper pipes are stolen. With the drug pandemic that also is infiltrating many of our rural places, especially here in the Western Cape. I can speak from experience there. So missing pipes, breaking pipes, water that is being seeping away. Even where I live, we have regular water bursts where thousands of liters run in the streets in a water scarce country. So I think in terms of, again, agency and action at the household level, we should really all, my students, myself with my household, those of you in this audience, whatever we can do at the household level to save water, we should be doing. And we should also get our government to do what it can and should do. We really should all be in it together, is basically what I'm trying to say, I guess.
Great. Well, I think we should start wrapping up, because I also know that you have another commitment after this.
Yes.
So I think maybe we can all just turn on our video and see how our connection handles that, just so that we can just show our faces and just say thank you for this amazing presentation. It's been incredibly useful. Claire, I see your hand is up. Do you want to come in and say something?
I just wanted to say that I'm going to be ending the poll now. So if there's anyone that hasn't responded to it yet, you have like 1 minute, and then I will end it and hand over to Tara to share those results. And I'm sharing the results. Can you see them?
Yeah, I can see them. I'm not sure if everyone else can see them. Yeah, most of us have experienced drought in the last between 2 or 10 years. And then in terms of different methods that people have used to cope, we have a lot of people resorting to rainwater harvesting and reusing water, repairing leaks. As Dr. Malgas mentioned, that's an important part of ensuring that at a household level, our water use is, infrastructure is taken care of. Then also the buying of water tanks. Here, I could have probably been a bit more specific, but I was in particular talking of buying water, tankards of water. And then, yeah, dry compost toilets, installing borehole or well point water. And then when we come more to the more kind of farming related approaches, drip irrigation, mulching, planting perennial foods to keep the soil covered, and retaining water on the land through digging swales along contours. And just before we leave, please, if people could write your name and organization in the chat. This is how we make a record of who has been in the seminar and who has not. So it's very important that you are putting your name and organization into the chat. And yeah, I just want to thank everyone again.